So we will enter now a bit ahead of time, but I believe we can start because all our participants are logged in. And I would like to enter the fifth panel, DAOs and Smart Contracts, by presenting its panel moderator, António Ferrão, Portugal Fintech. Portugal Fintech is also a partner of CDP in this event. So I would like to welcome Dr. António Ferrão, who has had a large professional exposure to fintechs and their particular challenges as a director to Fintech Solutions, an advisory arm of Portugal Fintech, which is creating and carving the future of digital financial services. And António is also a board member to Portugal Fintech, the first non-profit fintech community in Portugal. So a very heavy weight to have with us as a panel moderator for our last panel. António, I will hand the micro to you. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. As you can see, I'm not João. He cannot be here with us, but he asked me to come here, and I'm really happy. And thank you very much for the organization. An excellent event, especially because we are watching the perspective of the regulated instead of the fintech startups. So everyone is always asking for less regulation. So here is a little bit more, or at least more strict. But it's always great to hear different perspectives. So last panel, and I think let's just try to be on schedule. So I think I will pass for to introduce the first speaker, to Dr. Florian Möslein, to talk us about DAO. And just to make a brief introduction, and thank you also to the other speakers before. Professor Möslein is a chair of private law at German and European business law at the University of Marburg, where he teaches contract law, company law, and capital markets law. Professor Möslein holds a PhD from University of Hamburg, and he's also a lawyer in Germany. He's also speaking on the topic of DAOs, and I hope he's already with us, and I will pass the word to him.
So thanks a lot for this kind introduction, and also for having me, for having invited me, and congratulations to this conference. It's really been stimulating all over the day, and I have very much enjoyed listening to all presentations so far. It's a pity that I cannot be with you. It's due to medical reasons, but this time not COVID, but an eye surgery that I had to undergo, and I'm still not allowed to fly. So I had to stay in this country. However, I have very gladly accepted the invitation, and I would have loved to come to Lisbon, not only because of the beautiful city, but also because I am deeply impressed by all various initiatives that you are running in the field of blockchain, both in the field of private law, but also in the field of supervisory law. So having said that, I need to admit that the title of my presentation that you have given to me is a challenge. Let me briefly explain why it is a challenge, and I try to share my slides at this point. Now, the title is, of course, one of the shortest titles that I ever had a presentation on, only 4 letters. So it's going to be on DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which is, of course, a buzzword nowadays. And it's really close to my own research, and it has various connections, both to smart contracts, which we will discuss in a minute, but also to traditional corporate organizations and corporate law. A part of them that is less intensively discussed is the link to financial supervision, to financial markets, but that makes the topic even more interesting to have a look at this relationship. Now, why has it been intimidating to accept an invitation to talk about DAOs in Lisboa? Well, it is giving a presentation about DAOs in Lisboa is like bringing owls or carrying owls to Athens. Why is that so? Well, if you have a look at the website of your own institution, you have this wonderful DAO observatory with a range of interesting events, and in particular with a whole series of legal structure workshops going on. 2 already this year, and the topics in these workshops are really interesting and stimulating. Now, Lisbon is obviously the center of DAO research, and I was really wondering whether I could contribute anything new to the field. Now, that was one reason why I was very briefly hesitating. The other reason is that I had to struggle with the main topic of today's event and my topic of DAOs. I wasn't quite sure where the connection between DAOs on the one hand and the licensing principle on the other hand would really be. However, the organizers of this event have been very bright, very clever, and had a brilliant idea in combining these 2 topics. But it has only been very recently that it has become clear, at least to me, why this is the case. And I will take the advantage of this presentation to present you a bit and to explain a bit why I think that the licensing principle and DAOs will be a very interesting combination in the near future. I have 3 main parts of my presentation. I will first discuss quite briefly the legal structure of DAOs, which is of course well known, in particular so in Lisboa, but which needs to be discussed in order to lay the ground for the further discussion. I will then explain some economic functions of decentralized autonomous organizations with a specific focus on DeFi applications, and that will then lead me to the core question whether DAOs, at least DAOs in DeFi markets, need to be subject to a licensing requirement. Now, let me start with the legal structure. As I have said, DAOs are kind of a buzzword in the community. There are guidelines how to start a DAO. This book has recently been published, and it's really like a recipe for starting and for running DAOs. What is a DAO? Well, it's the basic definition describes DAOs as a DLT-based organization that is collectively owned and managed by its members. Now, that is very similar to something that we have already known in law for centuries, namely corporations. But the specific feature of DAOs is that it's really based on technology. It's based on distributed ledger technology, and it's therefore embedded in code rather than in law. Now, similar to those legal corporations, also the treasuries that are built in a DAO are only accessible with the approval of members. So it's really a member-driven organization. What is different from a traditional corporation is that DAO is much more decentralized, some even say democratized than a traditional company. It's run by its members rather than by a management board or some other sort of directors that hierarchically lead the organizations. Now, if we look at these basic elements of DAOs, we can simply say that it's a nexus of smart contracts. So it's really something that builds on the topics that we will discuss in a minute. Smart contracts are basically bilateral technical devices that are similar to legal contracts. DAOs, on the other hand, consist of a nexus of a network of such smart contracts, and thereby imitate what we know in law as corporations. one of the founding fathers, one of the pioneers of DAOs in the technological field, Christopher Jensch, once has even described DAOs as companies which consist only of computer code. Now, for us legal academics, that's of course a bit provocative, because the real question here is whether DAOs are corporations as we understand them. They are similar to corporations. They are organizations that are in some respects similarly organized, but they are based on technology rather than on legal provisions. So the question really is whether a DAO is a company, and if so, which legal form it takes. Now, if we look at the substance of decentralized autonomous organizations, it is similar, or it seems to be similar to a public limited company. Why? Well, given the smart contract basis, the members do not even know each other. There's typically a large number of members, and these members change very often. It's a very fluent membership, and that is similar to our public companies, even more so if you take the Portuguese or French or Italian name into account, Société Anonyme. So I am not able to pronounce it in Portuguese, but this anonymous society, this anonymous organization is very similar in substance to the pseudonymic character of DAOs. However, from a more formal perspective, DAOs lack key requirements of public limited companies. In particular, they are not necessarily, and they are typically not registered as public limited companies, and therefore a key precondition for their formation is really lacking here. And therefore, from a more formal perspective, most lawyers tend to qualify DAOs as partnerships. And also today, this morning, Dick Zetsche has mentioned that DAOs are a form of partnership, maybe a limited partnership, but still a form of partnership. However, from a substantive point of view, that is also problematic, because the typical feature of partnerships in substance is the close personal ties between the members. The intuitu personae characteristic of partnerships, as is it's sometimes formulated, that is a key component and a key idea of partnerships. Of course, we know also partnerships in law that consist of a large number of partners, but that is not the typical form of it. And DAOs typically lack this substantive element. So you see the tension here between some characteristics of public limited companies, but a lack of registration on the one hand, and on the other hand, the qualification of partnership is not very fitting either. In a very inspiring article, Antonio Garcia Rollo, of course from Lisbon, the place of DAO, as I have said, has explained these circumstances, this tension, in an article that has been published in 2019. And he concludes by saying that the current state of affairs, qualification of DAOs as partnerships, is not very satisfactory, and he claims that it's unsustainable in the medium term. So we need some sort of other solution, just because of this tension that I have tried to describe, which is, of course, much better described in his article. Now, on top of this legal qualification, there is a more recent phenomenon that I want to draw your attention to, which are legal wrappers for DAOs. There are a variety of service providers that offer that a DAO can be really literally wrapped in law. And that is somehow different from the legal qualification I have just spoken about. The legal qualification I've spoken about concerns DAOs as purely technical products, but of course DAOs can also opt into the law. They can choose a specific legal form rather than automatically being qualified as a crypto partnership, for example. Now, in the community, some claim that this is pretty much just a boring old legal company. It's compared to wet code because it's more flexible than the hard code of the blockchain. But still, there are incentives to being wrapped as a DAO. This legal wrapping protects members from unlimited liability. It also secures the treasury of the DAO, and it secures the possibility of members to vote in that organization. Now, more specifically, there is some choice on which legal form or concerning which legal form to opt into. And there are, on the one hand, the traditional legal forms. One option that is quite often recommended is the Swiss association. Others are UK or US based LLCs, or also UK or US based non-profit organizations. On the other hand, some jurisdictions have started to offer specific tailor-made legal forms. One example, and the leading example, is the Wyoming LLC DAO, a legal form that is specifically tailored to DAOs. Now, I cannot go more into detail on this, even though it's very interesting also from a regulatory competition perspective, also from a choice of law perspective. But there is increasingly literature on these legal wrappers. I want to draw your attention to this piece of Chris Brummer that is available on SSRN. There is not much empirical evidence, of course, with regard to the question which legal form is chosen, but there has been one sort of a question on Twitter recently by DeFi Prime addressed to DAO founders what their choice of legal option was. And as you see, it's not very clear. 25% do not opt into any entity at all. Another 27% choose one of these traditional legal forms with a focus on the Cayman Islands. That is more tax law driven, I guess. And only 10% opt into this new tailor-made regime of Wyoming. But there are also 36 other percentages, and I do not know which form they have chosen. So the picture really is very heterogeneous, and we cannot predict where this development will lead us to. That is the legal situation and the legal classification of DAOs. On the other hand, it is important and indeed crucial to look at the economic function of DAOs. I cannot give a complete overview here, but I have chosen what has recently figured as the top 10, as the 2022 top 10 of DAOs. And there are many examples, as you can see, from CurveDAO, MakerDAO, Uniswap, and many others. What I have tried to show by choosing these different colors are the various sectors that DAOs can be counted to. Now, that is, of course, not an exhaustive classification, but the red ones can roughly be classified as DeFi DAOs, whereas the yellow ones are more in the metaverse or gaming sector. And the green ones are a bit different. They are kind of platforms that allow the participants to create DAOs on their own. So that's a sort of meta DAO that allows for creating other DAOs. And then there is, of course, the other buzzword, namely NFTs, which is also a field of activity for DAOs. At any event, the DeFi sector plays an important role here, and at least the top three, so to say, even though not representative, but the top three DAOs on this slide are active in this field. Now, why is that so? In order to explain that, let me briefly describe the DeFi sector. We have already heard a lot about it today, but it's of course a financial services market segment that does not rely on intermediaries, or at least that promises not to rely on the traditional intermediaries like brokerages, exchanges, or banks. The core instrument are again smart contracts on a distributed ledger network or on a blockchain, and examples are borrowing and lending, peer-to-peer applications, or also decentralized exchanges, the so-called DEXs. The great promise, as I have said, is a alternative structure, an alternative architecture of finance with a strong focus on disintermediation and decentralization. So the ideas are largely congruent with what we have already heard today. There has been an interesting report published on DeFi recently by the European Blockchain Observatory just a few days ago. Now, with this broad picture of DeFi in mind, there is one key element of DeFi markets that I want to draw your attention to, because it is important for DAOs as well, or DAOs are important for this feature, and I'm referring to liquidity pools. Liquidity pools are important for DeFi markets because they literally provide the liquidity to all different sorts of DeFi markets, both to the borrowing and lending markets, but also to the exchanges and so forth, to all different sectors of DeFi markets. Now, in order for these markets to function, it is not sufficient to have just bilateral contracts between the market participants. Their supply and their demand is oftentimes not congruent, and therefore you need some sort of pool where you can really store the different either the demand side or the supply side input. And DAOs are now the device and the instrument that offers this kind of function. DAOs are really a pooling instrument that is crucial for DeFi markets. Again, self-executing smart contracts operate as a locker for crypto tokens that are supplied by platform users, and the organizational tool that is used for this purpose is the DAO, and therefore the DAO plays such an important role in DeFi markets. Just two snippets to underline that. What are liquidity pools? The funds that keep DeFi running. So that shows that liquidity pools are really important for DeFi markets, and on the other hand, the DAO is the means that allows running such liquidity pools. Now, let me bring these two ideas together, DeFi and DAO. This bringing together has gained some actuality recently with the crypto crash that has just started a month ago, with Terra Luna, Celsius Networks, Three Arrows Capitals, and other actors getting into trouble. Now, this crisis has given rise to calls for new regulation, both in the US and in Europe, and most importantly, at the European level. And there's already talk about a MiCAR 2, we have heard in one of the recent presentations by Filippo Annunziata about the MiCA 1, which is close to being finalized. But even before it is finalized, there's talk about MiCA 2. Why is that so? Well, MiCA does not cover large parts of the DeFi sector, and therefore the European Commission has started to dig into the DeFi sector. It has announced a report for 2023 and also a pilot project that wants to analyze the possibilities of DeFi supervision. Most importantly, just last week, the ECB president Christine Lagarde has, in a hearing before the or in a hearing of the European Parliament, has called for such MiCA 2 regulation for the regulation of DeFi markets. And one of the key messages in her speech was really that the regulation of decentralized finance needs to be addressed where there are no intermediaries. Now, this really is targeted at the topic that I have been just talking about. It is targeted at liquidity pools, at DAOs, at these players that replace the traditional intermediaries without themselves being such intermediaries in the notion that we know. Now, let me come to my final, almost final slide. It is too early to really predict what such MiCA 2 will bring. But after the recent crypto crisis, it is fair to say that the regulatory focus will certainly be on financial stability, and liquidity pools play a central role for stable DeFi markets. And therefore, it wouldn't be surprising, at least, if DAOs could be, or if this MiCA 2 would address DAOs as a subject of regulation and even as a subject of a licensing requirement in future DeFi markets. However, the problem is that DAOs are not legal persons, not necessarily, at least, if they have no legal wrapper. They are maybe partnerships, but we don't really know. And therefore, the problem and the challenge for the lawmaker and also for supervisory authorities will be, how can a supervisory authority regulate? How can it supervise? How can it subject DAOs to a licensing principle? There's some sort of model regulation, the German law and the German provision on crypto custodians. But again, this provision, it contains a licensing principle, but it's only targeted at financial institutions, at financial institutes, and there's no reference to DAOs, for instance, and therefore it risks to not to reach its goal. The positive message of my presentation is that if that comes true, if really DAOs become subject to financial supervision and to financial regulation, that might turn out to be an initiative for the lawmaker, a kind of transmission belt for the lawmaker to grant legal personality to DAOs and to create a legal framework that is suitable for them. So this development that we have seen in Wyoming might become even more forceful due to financial regulation needs. And that might be promising for us private laws as well, because it might lead to a DAO-specific regulation and a DAO-specific framing for these new sorts of organizations. Now, this shows that Lisbon is really the center of it. All roads lead to Lisbon. And it's interesting and nice to see that you managed to combine both sides of the DAO research with the focus on legal structures on the one hand and the focus on fintech regulation on the other hand, because that really draws the whole picture of DAOs. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much forward to the discussion.